Hello and welcome to Rotary's Couch Conversations. My name is Bev Unitt. It's an absolute pleasure today to welcome Gary Newton, a member of Rotary Geelong East, but even more importantly, a board member and secretary of Polio Australia Incorporated. Welcome, Gary.
Hi, Beverly. Thank you. It's nice to be with you.
It's great to have your company. As many Rotarians know, there's a big shift across the world that we've been able to create with eradicating polio in so many countries. But it's even more than that. There's a whole lot of things going on in the background that some people may not be aware of about how polio affects people. And Gary, would you mind sharing a little bit of your journey and your story and what's brought you to the board of Polio Australia so that we can raise awareness about what's going on in the background?
Yeah, sure, Bev. Thanks very much for the opportunity to do that, by the way. So my journey with polio actually began a very, very long time ago. In fact, when I was 15 months old, I contracted paralytic polio. And that journey has been an interesting one, of course, because it's been a daily challenge for me. But the Polio Australia Association came into being probably about 4 years ago now, when I started to read about people in your state, in matter of fact, in Queensland, who were encouraging others to have things like chickenpox parties and to not vaccinate their children. And it really sort of hit a chord for me, because I thought, gee, you know, my mum and dad would have given an arm or a leg to be able to protect me from polio, and yet here we have people who are not just of the belief that for whatever reason they've determined that vaccines are somehow no good, but they're actively promoting the fact that people should not go out and protect their children from a vaccine preventable disease that could well and truly change their life forever. So I got in contact with Polio Australia. They invited me, because of my background in the media, to take part actually in an international post-polio conference that they were holding in Sydney back in September of 2016. I went along, and it was there that I sort of formed stronger connections and bonds with the people from Polio Australia. Got to meet a lot more polio survivors, because up until about that point, I hadn't really connected with polio as such, because I mean, I knew I'd had it, but that was pretty much it, Bev. It was a case of, this is my life. And I think what happens with most people who've got a disability, they just get on with it, you know. And so it was great to be a part of that conference. And it was there that I met a Rotarian called Jenny Horton, who'd been working in Nigeria, helping with the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the Polio Plus program. And she said to me, have you ever thought about going to India? And so that opened up another door. And it's really been quite fascinating, the journey that has taken place over the last few years. Yeah.
So when you went to India, that was as an ambassador representing Polio Australia?
Well, not actually, no. It was more of a personal visit. It had been suggested, as I said, that might be a good thing to do. And I wanted it to be something that perhaps could be more encompassing than just me as a polio survivor going to India. So I managed to organise some others from here in Geelong, where I live, who are polio survivors, to come with me, and my wife, who's a non-polio survivor. So there was 5 of us that went to India, and for 10 days. Before we went, we decided we also would like to get involved with not just helping vaccinate children, which was something that obviously my parents would have desperately loved to have been able to do for me, but we wanted to try and help and reach out to polio survivors in India, and obviously a massive task, given the 1.4 million people that make up the population of India, and there are many millions of people that have contracted polio over there. But we did hook up with a Rotary club in Visakhapatnam, which is down on the east coast of India, and we were able to speak at that meeting, and a large number of polio survivors came along that day, and we got to meet them and hear some of their stories, etc., and see how they survive and cope. And so it was, it was a really interesting journey. But we managed to raise just over $60,000 before we went, because we wanted to not only sort of get out and vaccinate kids while we were there, but we wanted to make a difference in so far as making a donation to Polio Australia, which we did. We contributed $25,000 to their eradication and, well, not so much eradication, but their educational programs. And also we were able to give some money to Rotary, which, of course, under the 2-for-1 scheme that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has, turned into a donation of $60,000 to the Rotary Foundation.
Wow, fantastic. What a rewarding experience, yeah.
It's been amazing.
Sorry, Gary. Back here in Australia, it's I saw you speak a few weeks back, and this is why I wanted to let's have a chat on Couch Conversations. I was flabbergasted to discover there's hundreds of thousands of Australians who initially contracted polio, and those who are still surviving this day and age, even though it's a vaccination now in Australia. There's still an ongoing effect with so many people who are affected. Could you share a little bit about what we're not aware of behind the scenes for the people who have been living with polio?
Sure, absolutely. Well, through the 30s, 40s and 50s, they were the epidemic years. A lot of people contracted polio, and not unlike COVID today, vast majority of those people contracted it quite mildly, to a point where the majority, probably 90%, made a full recovery. However, there was a small percentage of people like myself, probably 1% of those who contracted polio, who got paralytic polio, which is the most obvious and severe form of the disease, which creates paralysis. And it's only noticeable when at least 50% of the motor neurons associated with either the arms or the legs or the part of the body that polio actually attacks, because it is a disease that affects the central nervous system. That's when the paralysis sets in, and of course it manifests itself in many different ways with most people, or with different people. But certainly for those of us who contracted polio of a paralytic nature, there are still tens of thousands of us left in Australia. And the thing that, of course, has happened is that we've become the forgotten generation. I think most people are well aware of the stolen generation and the struggles of our Indigenous people in that capacity. But what most people have forgotten is that through the 30s, 40s and 50s, as people contracted polio largely as children, because it is a disease that affects kids under the age of 5, those kids went on to lead very successful lives at times, very full lives with being married and having children and now grandchildren, but they're all forgotten. They've been forgotten because they were kids back then. We were all cute and cuddly and all that sort of stuff, and there were the telethons that were conducted in many states of Australia. I know from Melbourne, living in Melbourne, growing up in Melbourne, Channel 9 had a telethon every year that helped raise money to help Urala, which was a special school for crippled children. And but what happened was that as we grew older, the community forgot that there were still all of these people out there. And so what Polio Australia is attempting to do is help people, polio survivors in particular, come to grips with what is now known as the late effects of polio, which is a recognised condition in the medical fraternity as being a post-polio syndrome. And I suspect that we will see similar things happening down the track in another 20, 30, 40 years, who knows, with COVID-19. We don't know at this stage what those long-term effects will be. We do know now about polio. We know how it impacts people. quite a large proportion of polio survivors, even those who may have had it very, very mildly, will now likely be experiencing some form of post-polio syndrome. And so what Polio Australia is doing is helping educate the medical fraternity, healthcare professionals, because hardly anybody going through med school today, learning about physiotherapy or occupational therapists and the like, learn anything at all about polio. And so there's still this, huge number of people out there that need support and help, and yet the medical fraternity largely have no real knowledge of what's happening. So we're doing a number of, we've been running now for a number of years with the help of Rotary, who have helped set up the initial pilot scheme, and the support of the federal government, a number of healthcare education clinics all around Australia. And so Polio Australia goes out and does that with Michael Jackson, who's our clinical health educator, and talks to healthcare professionals. And then we've got another lady called Steph Cantrell. Steph talks to polio survivors from various parts of Australia about how they can help themselves, and other methods that will help support them through the late effects of polio.
I like that you put that on the table, actually, because until I'd heard you speak a few weeks ago, I hadn't even given it a thought. I knew of its existence, like in the 40s, 50s and so on, with polio, and I'd come across a person now and again, but never gave it a thought. So I take that on myself, and I can respect and appreciate how in the clinical education space, it could be very easily forgotten that there are still survivors.
Yeah,
and so quite young nurses, young doctors, they'd never have come across it to actually know what's really going on for these people in front of them.
Sure. Well, record keeping back in the 30s, 40s and 50s wasn't particularly good, and we don't have specific numbers for people who contracted polio, not like we do today with obviously the figures worldwide for COVID-19. We do know that there's somewhere between 20 to 40,000 people in Australia alone who contracted paralytic polio. And so and a lot of those people now are in their 60s and 70s, but they're still alive. I mean, given modern medicine and the old 70 as it used to be, the age of people passing away has well and truly been increased, the number. And so there's this need for support for polio survivors. Obviously, Polio Australia and Rotarians fully support the Global Polio Eradication Initiative that was set up all those years ago, back in the late 70s by Sir Clem Ranulph, who was the Rotary International President from the Rotary Club of Nambour back then, and all that flowed from that, which has been absolutely phenomenal. But
Gary, can I just put on the table to me then that raises another concern too, because as you mentioned, like the old 70, that was 70 for somebody who's wondering what 70 was.
Yes,
but these days in Australia, a woman's average length of life is 84.9 and a man's is around 82.9, I think. And so people who are suddenly entering their 60s and still suffering from polio, something happens for them where they're affected. And you've brought some attention of this to the Royal Commission for the Disability that's going on at the moment. You've been able to bring some attention or flag some attention, because this is really important, because 65-year-old people suffering still in Australia with the repercussions of having polio as a child have another 20 years of life yet.
Exactly. And sadly, they're locked out of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is a tremendous scheme that's been set up to help people with disability. But it was decided somewhere along the way, I'm not sure what the origins of it were, but I know that the laws were changed, the discrimination laws were changed to prevent and lock out those aged 65 and above from the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So I've been very fortunate, Bev, insofar as that the National Disability Insurance Scheme was launched in Geelong, and the headquarters is here in Geelong. It was launched about 4 years ago, if I'm right, maybe a bit longer. and of course, it started in Geelong. And at that point, I was under the age of 65. So I'm now 68. And then the NDIS was rolled out to various parts of Australia. I'm not even 100% sure whether it's been completely rolled out to all parts of Australia yet. But the sad thing is that if you're in the NDIS, you get tremendous support in terms of mobility aids and home help and all those sorts of things. But if you're not in the NDIS, you fall under the aged care system banner, and that is not set up for people with disabilities. And so I think there's something like $500 available for a wheelchair. So for those of us who need a wheelchair to get out and about and get around, which typically costs around $20,000, $500 doesn't take you anywhere at all. So Polio Australia have put in a submission to the Disability Royal Commission saying that we want to see the NDIS Act amended so that polio survivors over 65 are eligible for the NDIS, and that the Act be amended so to remove the exclusion of disabled persons, because it is discriminatory, and it certainly contravenes a number of articles from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So, and it's really disappointing that the current government and governments associated with the introduction of the NDIS actually worked to prevent people from the age of 65 being prohibited from joining the scheme. It's meant hardship for a lot of people. I'm one of the lucky ones, but there are an awful lot of others, tens of thousands of people that could seriously benefit from being included in the NDIS. And so we're hoping to get some recognition there and some changes made, which I think is only fair, given that, if you're 64 and you happen to be in the area where it's rolled out, you're fine. But if you're 65 and it doesn't roll out until you get to 67 or 66, you can't be in it. It's not. Yeah,
so true. Right. Well, I'm a great believer in people do the best they can with what they know at the time, and when they know better, they can do better.
Sure thing.
So to me, that hats off to yourself and all the team at Polio Australia for taking that great awareness forward to the Royal Commission, because that will make a difference. That there's 20 years of life here where we can support a lot, at least. We can support a lot of people. But very importantly, Gary, I want to thank you for your time as a Rotarian, but also in raising awareness with Polio Australia, because as a Rotarian myself, I was fully aware of the great work Australia does with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the eradication of polio. But I had no concept that there are people still suffering with the aftermath of polio. And I thank you very much for the great work you and your team are doing, and especially being able to share with fellow Rotarians and the general community on this little chat today that there are people out there who are still suffering, and there's a lot more we can do. And well done on the clinical awareness and raising that. That's a big thing, to be able to get out to young medical professionals and say, this is the education you need, because quite frankly, for the next 2 decades, they are the people who are looking after and supporting and caring and making a difference to people still suffering from the aftermath of polio.
Yeah. The other thing, of course, Bev, is the fact that, there are people coming from other countries who are suffering from polio, who are much younger. And the good thing is, of course, for them, they will be admitted into the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So they'll have that support. And that support, may be required for the next 50 or 60 years for some of them, because, they're relatively young. The other thing that I wanted to point out quickly, if I may, before we close today, is the fact that the initial Rotary International pledge or acknowledgement that was made back in 1979 or a bit after, I think, when the Polio Plus program started, was that it was based around the words of eradicating polio from the world and alleviating its consequences. And that part of it, the second part of the resolution, the Rotary International Resolution, has largely also been forgotten. And so as a Rotarian, myself and a polio survivor, and I love to talk to Rotary clubs and remind them of that, because that's another thing that's been forgotten, a bit like, you know, the general population has forgotten about the kids that are still, you know, that are now adults and are still suffering from polio. Rotarians have largely forgotten about that second part, alleviating the consequences. And so I like to encourage Rotary clubs to get together with their foundation committee members and their fundraising committee members and say, all right, let's set some money aside, as we do for the foundation, to eradicate polio, but let's also think about what we could perhaps do fundraising-wise in helping organisations such as Polio Australia to support those healthcare professional workshops and things like that. So
yeah, very good point.
That's another thing that's well worth keeping in mind as Rotarians, I think.
Yeah. Hey, Gary, thank you for raising that. That's an incredibly important point, because, you know, it's like putting petrol in the car and no oil. It's half the job, isn't it?
True.
So, yeah, let's take care of the alleviation too. So thank you very much for raising that. Gary, you're a champion man. You're doing a great service, not only, you know, to your local community in Geelong, but also to people worldwide and Australia-wide specifically, suffering from polio, because it's not just the person who's suffering, it's their family and their connections and their carers and the people around them who could do with a little bit of support and acknowledgement. So thank you for putting it on the table, and thank you for being available for our couch conversations. And
good to talk to you
really
today.
respect what you're doing. Thank you, Gary.
Okay.
Bye for now.
You've been listening to Couch Conversations, brought to you by Frankston North Rotary. To discover more about Rotary, ask a question, explore if Rotary is ideal for you, please connect on our Facebook page or via email.